Imagine, for a moment, stepping into a world where dinner parties could end with poisonings just for fun, where people paid for their crimes by being locked inside a room with a deadly snake, or where brides had to prove their worth by surviving a night alone in a forest filled with wild animals. These weren't scenes from a dark fairy tale, they were real customs practiced by ancient civilizations, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. Welcome to a journey through time, where we uncover 30 of the most bizarre, shocking, and downright unbelievable traditions our ancestors thought were perfectly normal. From the moment humans began forming societies, we've crafted rituals, laws, and social norms that sometimes make modern minds reel. Some were rooted in superstition, others in sheer spectacle, and a few seem like they were dreamed up just to test the limits of human endurance. Picture this: entire cities shutting down for weeks to celebrate by hurling insults at their leaders, or warriors drinking the blood of their enemies to absorb their strength. These weren't outliers, they were everyday occurrences in cultures across the globe, and today we're pulling back the curtain on the strangest of them all. What makes these customs so fascinating isn't just their shock value, it's what they reveal about the people who lived by them. Behind every odd tradition lies a story of fear, power, love, or even humor. Some were meant to intimidate, others to unite, and a few were just plain bizarre with no explanation at all. But one thing's for sure, by the time we're done, you'll never look at history the same way again. So buckle up, because this isn't your average history lesson. This is a deep dive into the weird, the wild, and the wonderfully strange side of the past, where every custom comes with a story that's hard to believe and even harder to forget. One of the most persistent misconceptions about ancient Rome is the idea of the vomitorium, a room where decadent elites supposedly purged their stomachs after lavish feasts to make room for more eating. It's a sensational image, evoking scenes of excess and gluttony, but here's the truth: the vomitorium had nothing to do with vomiting. The word actually comes from the Latin voma, meaning to spew forth, and it referred to the large passageways in amphitheaters and stadiums designed to rapidly spew out crowds of spectators. These architectural marvels allowed thousands of people to exit efficiently after events, a testament to Roman engineering genius. So how did this mix-up happen? The modern myth likely took root in the 19th century, when historians and writers, perhaps misled by the word's graphic sound, spun exaggerated tales of Roman decadence. The idea fit neatly with popular stereotypes of the empire's excesses, from Emperor Nero's legendary parties to rumors of lavish banquets featuring dishes like stuffed dormice and flamingo tongues. But while the Romans certainly knew how to indulge, the vomitorium's real story is far more practical and impressive. Consider the Colosseum, which could hold up to 80,000 people. Without these carefully designed exits, evacuating such a massive crowd would have been chaos. The vomitoria were a stroke of logistical brilliance, allowing Romans to move seamlessly in and out of grand venues. It's a reminder that history is often stranger and smarter than fiction. The next time you hear someone joke about Roman vomitoria, you'll know the truth. They weren't rooms of excess but masterpieces of crowd control, proving once again that reality can be just as fascinating as the myths we invent. The ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify their pharaohs, they preserved creatures by the millions, from tiny scarab beetles to towering crocodiles, all in the name of the gods. This wasn't just a niche practice, it was an industry. Archaeologists have uncovered entire underground catacombs packed floor to ceiling with mummified ibises, falcons, and even baboons, sometimes stacked so densely that the walls seem to pulse with the remains of sacred animals. Imagine walking through these tunnels where every step crunches under layers of linen-wrapped bundles, each one a carefully prepared offering to deities like Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, or Bastet, the fierce feline protector of home and hearth. But why animals? In Egyptian belief, creatures weren't just symbols of the gods. They were living incarnations of divine power. A cat might channel Bastet's grace, while a crocodile embodied the raw might of Sobek, the fearsome god of the Nile's fertility and chaos. By mummifying these animals, worshippers believed they could send their prayers directly to the gods, like spiritual postage stamped with fur and feathers. Some offerings were grand, like the gilded crocodiles placed in elaborate temples, while others were humble. Think of a farmer wrapping a shrew in linen, hoping for a good harvest. The scale was staggering. In one catacomb alone, over 4 million ibis mummies were found, and at the site of Saqqara, archaeologists unearthed a mass grave of nearly 8 million dog mummies. Workshops near temples functioned like sacred assembly lines where priests bred, raised, and prepared animals for mummification. Some creatures died naturally, but others were likely sacrificed, a sobering reminder that devotion often came with a cost. Yet not all these mummies were what they seemed. Modern scans have revealed something startling. Many bundles contain only partial remains or even random bones and sticks cleverly wrapped to resemble animals. It seems even ancient Egyptians dealt with supply chain issues, and some priests may have cut corners to meet the overwhelming demand for divine favors. This practice wasn't just about religion, it was big business. Pilgrims traveled from across Egypt to buy mummies as offerings, fueling a thriving temple economy. The more lavish the mummy, the louder the prayer. A wealthy noble might donate a gilded falcon, while a peasant could offer a simple clay figurine. But all were united by the same hope that these creatures, frozen in time, would carry their pleas into the afterlife. What's left today are silent tunnels of linen and bone, a testament to a civilization that saw the divine in every living thing. The next time you see a cat lazing in the sun, remember, to an ancient Egyptian that wasn't just a pet. It was a tiny god wrapped in reverence, waiting to deliver a message to the heavens. For nearly 1,000 years, a practice so agonizing it made walking feel like walking on broken glass was considered the height of elegance in imperial China. Foot binding, the brutal reshaping of young girls' feet into tiny, curved lotus blossoms, wasn't just about beauty. It was a painful passport to privilege, a deformity worn like a badge of honor by women of the elite. The process began as early as 4 or 5 years old, when a girl's feet were soaked in warm water and herbs to soften them before the real ordeal. Then her toes, all but the big one, were bent under the sole and bound tightly with long strips of cloth, often forcing the toes to break. Over months or even years, the bindings were tightened, slowly crushing the arch of the foot upward to create that coveted 3-inch shape, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The origins of this excruciating tradition trace back to the 10th century, when Emperor Lai Yu of the southern Tang dynasty became enchanted by his concubine's delicate dancing on a golden lotus platform. Her feet, bound to resemble crescent moons, were said to glide like whispers across the floor. Soon, aristocratic women, and later, families aspiring to higher status adopted the practice, turning tiny feet into a non-negotiable marker of marriageability and refinement. Bound feet weren't just pretty, they signaled that a woman came from a family so wealthy she didn't need to work. A peasant's daughter who labored in rice fields couldn't afford to be crippled, but a noblewoman's value was literally measured by how little she could walk. The consequences were devastating. Infections were rampant, toes often rotted away, and many women spent their lives in chronic pain, their feet permanently locked in a grotesque, hoof-like curve. Some accounts describe mothers and grandmothers tightening the bindings until their daughters fainted, believing the screams were proof the ritual was working. Yet despite the suffering, foot binding became deeply romanticized. Erotic poetry praised the fragrant hooks, and tiny embroidered shoes were exchanged as love tokens. Men allegedly found the mincing gait it produced a wobbly walk called the lotus gait, irresistibly feminine. By the 19th century, foot binding had spread far beyond the elite, with an estimated 1 to 2 billion women subjected to it. But winds of change were blowing. Christian missionaries and Chinese reformers began condemning the practice as barbaric, and in the early 20th century, anti-foot binding societies sprang up, some even offering cash rewards for families who let their daughters' feet grow free. The final death knell came when the new communist government banned it outright in 1949, branding it a relic of feudal oppression. Today, the last generation of women with bound feet are living reminders of a beauty standard that turned pain into power. Their stories are a chilling lesson in how far societies will go to control women's bodies, and how something so cruel could be wrapped in silk and called grace. In the harsh, iron-willed world of ancient Sparta, survival wasn't just a matter of chance, it was a test administered at birth. Unlike other Greek city-states where newborns were celebrated unconditionally, Spartan elders approached infancy like military recruiters evaluating raw recruits. Within days of a child's arrival, a council of grizzled inspectors known as the Gerousia would descend on the family home, their eyes scanning for any hint of weakness. A baby with even a minor deformity, a frail cry, or a perceived lack of vigor was swiftly condemned. The verdict: exposure on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, where the elements or hungry wolves would decide their fate. This brutal practice, called apotempanismos, wasn't just about cruelty, it was the foundation of Sparta's entire philosophy. In a society that worshipped strength above all else, every citizen was a soldier in training, and weakness threatened the collective survival of the state. Spartans believed that only the physically flawless deserved to inherit their warrior legacy. Even the great philosopher Plato, though critical of the practice, conceded that Sparta's ruthless selectivity produced the finest race of men in Greece. But the inspections didn't stop at birth. For those who passed the first test, life remained a gauntlet of trials. At age 7, boys were torn from their mothers and thrust into the agoge, a state-run boot camp where they endured starvation, beatings, and brutal games designed to weed out the unfit. One ritual, the diamastagosis, involved flogging contestants at the altar of Artemis until their blood stained the ground, a test of endurance where collapsing meant disgrace. Girls, too, faced scrutiny, though their training focused on bearing strong offspring. They competed in athletics, wrestled, and ate hearty meals, a stark contrast to the delicate ideals of Athens. What's chilling is how normalized this all was. Parents who resisted abandoning their infants faced public shaming or exile. The historian Plutarch recounts how one Spartan father, ashamed his son flinched in battle, killed him with the words, "You are no offspring of mine." Even love bent to duty, yet Sparta's infanticide wasn't unique. Similar practices existed in Rome and among Germanic tribes, but nowhere was it so systematized. Modern excavations at Taygetus reveal small bones, silent witnesses to a society that traded mercy for might. Today, we recoil at such ruthlessness, but Sparta's ghost lingers in questions about how far societies should go in pursuit of perfection. After all, their perfect warriors still fell when Thebes shattered their invincibility at Leuctra. Perhaps true strength isn't just in the body, but in the humanity we refuse to sacrifice. To the ancient Maya, blood wasn't just life, it was sacred fuel that kept the cosmos running. While modern religions might offer prayers or sacrifices, Maya rulers took devotion to a visceral extreme, slicing their own flesh to feed the gods. At the heart of this practice was a chilling belief: without royal blood, the sun would refuse to rise, crops would wither, and time itself would unravel. The rituals often began in the dim glow of dawn, with nobles assembling in temple courtyards. A king might draw a stingray spine or an obsidian blade tool sharper than steel, and drive it through his tongue, letting the blood cascade onto bark paper. Others chose an even more excruciating path, piercing their genitals with ropes of thorns, the pain a testament to their dedication. The blood-soaked paper would then be burned, its smoke carrying the essence of life straight to the heavens. What's astonishing is how calculated this suffering was. These weren't frenzied acts of fanaticism but meticulously choreographed ceremonies. Surviving carvings show queens pulling thorn-studded ropes through their tongues with serene expressions, their pain transformed into a sacred performance. The blood itself was considered a royal currency, more valuable than gold or jade, because only the elite had the divine lineage to nourish the gods. But why such extremes? The Maya saw blood as a binding force. The same substance that animated humans also flowed through the veins of the cosmos. Creation myths told of gods spilling their own blood to form humanity, and rulers saw themselves as repaying that debt. During celestial crises like droughts or eclipses, bloodletting intensified, a desperate plea to restore balance. One famous relief at Yaxchilan shows Lady Zok, a powerful queen, conjuring a vision serpent through her blood sacrifice, the serpent's jaws cradling a warrior. Proof her suffering had opened a portal to the spirit world. The aftermath was just as revealing. Nobles proudly displayed their scars as badges of honor, and bloodletting tools were buried with kings as vital afterlife provisions. Even the act of pain held meaning. The louder a ruler's groans, the more potent the offering was believed to be. Yet this practice wasn't unique to royalty. Commoners, too, pierced their ears and cheeks during festivals, though their blood carried less cosmic weight. The difference, scale, and spectacle. A king's blood might be offered to mark the building of a new temple or the birth of an heir, events witnessed by thousands, while a farmer's sacrifice was a private plea for rain. Modern excavations have uncovered grim proof of these rituals: obsidian blades still crusted with hemoglobin, murals of rulers holding bowls of their own blood. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is how these acts were framed not as self-destruction, but as the ultimate act of creation. To the Maya, every drop of blood was a thread stitching the universe together, a reminder that sometimes keeping the world alive requires more than just belief. It demands flesh and pain. By the time Spanish chroniclers arrived, they recoiled at what they saw as barbarism, failing to grasp that for the Maya, this was the purest form of diplomacy, a negotiation with the divine where blood was the only language the gods understood. Today, as we study these rituals, we're left with an unsettling question. How far would we go to save our own world if we truly believed its survival depended on our suffering? In the flickering torchlight of an Athenian symposium, the air hummed with wine, wit, and a game that turned drinking into an art form. These weren't rowdy tavern gatherings, but meticulously staged displays of intellect and dexterity, where elite men reclined on cushioned couches, balancing kylixes of diluted wine while debating the nature of virtue, and then flinging the dregs at targets across the room. Welcome to the world of katabos, a game so beloved it became the centerpiece of Greek aristocratic social life, blending philosophy with what looks suspiciously like college drinking antics. The rules were simple, but the execution required finesse. Players would swing their wine cups in precise arcs, launching the last drops of liquid at a small bronze disc balanced atop a stand. A direct hit would send the disc clattering onto a larger plate below, a feat called katabos in the middle, while near misses sparked laughter and playful taunts. Some versions even involved floating shallow dishes in water, with competitors aiming to sink them with well-timed splashes. The real magic, though, lay in the stakes. A successful toss wasn't just for bragging rights. It was often dedicated to a lover, with the clang of the disc acting as a divination tool. A clean hit meant your affection was reciprocated, while a miss spelled romantic doom. But why combine heavy philosophy with what amounts to an ancient wine-throwing contest? For the Greeks, symposia were about balancing the cerebral and the sensual. The event followed strict rituals. Guests arrived crowned with ivy, drank from shared vessels of wine mixed with water, a safeguard against excess, though not always effective, and debated topics ranging from politics to poetry, all while slaves refilled their cups. The Catobos game served as a release valve, a way to puncture the evening's high-minded tension with physical play. Even Plato's dialogues hint at this duality. His Symposium features speeches on love interrupted by a drunken Alcibiade stumbling in, a reminder that even the loftiest discussions happened amid revelry. The couches themselves were a social minefield. Reclining sideways, propped on one elbow, was a privilege reserved for freeborn men-women, if present, sat upright, and slaves stood ready to serve. The arrangement created an intimate, almost theatrical space where every gesture was scrutinized. Spilling your wine during Catobos wasn't just clumsy, it risked revealing a lack of sophrosyne that prized Greek virtue of self-control. Archaeologists have found Catobos stands from Sicily to the Black Sea, proof of its spread across the Mediterranean. But by the 4th century BC, the game faded, dismissed by later writers as frivolous. Yet for centuries, it was the glue of Greek social life, a reminder that even the most solemn societies need moments where wisdom and whimsy collide. Next time you raise a glass, imagine the Greeks who turned drinking into a sport, proving that sometimes the deepest connections are forged not just in words, but in the perfect arc of a flying drop of wine. When a Viking chieftain drew his last breath, his people didn't just bury him, they launched him into the afterlife on a blazing inferno worthy of the sagas. Picture this, a mighty longship, its sail billowing not with wind but with flames, drifting down a river or pushed out to sea, carrying the fallen leader along with his swords, shields, and even the loyal thralls who volunteered or were chosen to accompany him. This wasn't mere ceremony, it was a cosmic send-off designed to equip the dead for the battles and feasts awaiting them in Valhalla. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed one such funeral in the 10th century, left a jaw-dropping account. The chieftain's body was dressed in his finest clothes and placed aboard a ship hauled onto shore. Around him, his weapons were arranged, along with food, drink, and even slaughtered horses and dogs, creatures believed to serve him in the afterlife. Then came the most chilling detail, a young enslaved woman who, after days of ritual preparation, was ceremonially sacrificed to join her master. As the flames engulfed the ship, the crowd roared, their voices mingling with the crackle of fire, all to ensure the chief's journey was as grand as his life had been. But why such extravagance? To the Vikings, death was a voyage, and a warrior needed the right provisions. Odin's hall, Valhalla, promised endless battle by day and feasting by night, but only for those who arrived properly equipped. A chief without his sword would be shamed, one without his gold might starve. Even the ship itself was crucial. Norsemen believed the afterlife lay across water, and what better vessel than the same craft that had carried him to glory in life? Not all funerals were this elaborate. Commoners might be cremated on simple pyres with a single weapon or keepsake, but for the elite, the spectacle was everything. Some burials, like the Oseberg ship in Norway, contained not just treasures but carts, sleds, and even peacocks, exotic imports that screamed status. Archaeologists have found charred rivets and blackened nails, silent evidence of these floating bonfires. What's striking is how calculated the chaos was. The sacrifices weren't random, they mirrored the chief's earthly power. A warlord might take his horses for the rides to come, while a trader could be sent off with scales and weights. And the burning ship, practical as much as symbolic fire, purified the body, speeding its passage to the gods while ensuring no enemy could desecrate the grave. Modern reconstructions, like the 2016 funeral of a reconstructed Viking ship in Norway, show just how awe-inspiring these rituals were. Flames leaping 30 feet into the sky, the heat so intense spectators had to step back, yet to the Vikings, this wasn't destruction. It was transformation. A chief's pyre wasn't an end, it was the first blaze of his next great adventure. The Aztecs didn't just worship their gods, they fed them. On the steps of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, priests performed sacrifices so frequent and bloody that Spanish conquistadors claimed the stench of rotting blood hung over the city like a fog. Victims, sometimes thousands in a single ceremony, were led up the temple stairs, their chests sliced open with obsidian knives, their still beating hearts ripped out and raised to the sun. The bodies were then flung down the steps, where they piled up like grim offerings at the feet of deities like Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war who thirsted for human life. But this wasn't mindless brutality. To the Aztecs, sacrifice was a sacred exchange, a way to repay the cosmic debt they believed kept the world alive. Their creation myths told of gods who'd sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion, spilling their own blood to create humanity. In return, humans had to nourish the gods with the most precious substance they possessed, life itself. Without it, the sun would halt, crops would fail, and the universe would collapse. Spanish accounts describe a staggering scale. Some scholars estimate 20,000 victims per year, though modern research suggests the real number was likely lower. Still, the imagery is haunting. Skull racks called tees apparently held thousands of heads, and at one site, archaeologists uncovered a tower of over 600 skulls, many with holes drilled through the sides so they could be strung on wooden poles. The victims weren't random. Many were captured warriors from the Flower War's ritual battles staged specifically to take prisoners for sacrifice. Others were slaves, criminals, or even volunteers who believed dying for the gods would grant them honor. Children, too, were offered to Tlaloc, the rain god, their tears considered a potent omen of coming storms. The rituals followed strict scripts. A victim might be dressed as a god before death, their flesh eaten by nobles in a grim communion. Some were given hallucinogens to ease their fear, others fought fiercely, knowing their fate. What's often overlooked is the sheer spectacle. Sacrifices coincided with celestial events like solstices or eclipses, turning death into theater. Drums pounded as priests in flayed skins danced, and the crowd watched, believing each heart torn out delayed the apocalypse by another day. Even the act of disposal was ritualized. Bodies were sometimes given to warriors as trophies, or their skins worn by priests in ceremonies lasting days. The Spanish saw this as demonic, but the Aztecs saw it as duty. Their entire calendar revolved around appeasing gods who demanded blood as routinely as we pay taxes. Modern excavations confirm their account. Soil beneath temples is still stained with iron, and carvings show eagles feasting on human hearts. Yet for all its horror, this wasn't unique. The Maya, the Carthaginians, even the Celts practiced human sacrifice. The Aztecs were simply the most systematic, turning what others did in shadows into a state-sponsored act of faith. Perhaps what unsettles us most isn't just the violence, but the cold logic behind it. In a world where the gods were always hungry, the Aztecs did what they thought necessary to survive. Their sacrifices weren't acts of cruelty, but of desperation. A people trying to buy one more sunrise with the only currency the universe would accept. In the shadow of Rome's roaring amphitheaters, where gladiators clashed for the crowd's delight, an unexpected black market thrived, one dealing not in gold or spices but in human sweat. After the battles ended and the sand was raked clean of blood, spectators didn't just disperse, they swarmed the fighters, not for autographs, but to scrape perspiration from their skin with tiny spoons called strigils. This gladiator sweat, mixed with dust and oil, was bottled and sold as a potent elixir, believed to cure ailments, boost virility, or even transfer the warrior's strength to whoever rubbed it on their body. The demand stemmed from a deep-rooted Roman superstition that gladiators, men who cheated death daily, possessed a mystical life force. Their sweat, blood, and even the grime from their weapons were thought to be charged with power, much like relics of saints in later eras. Wealthy matrons paid exorbitant sums for vials of these essences, using them as aphrodisiacs or fertility treatments. Physicians of the era, like the famed Galen, wrote prescriptions calling for gladiator blood to treat epilepsy or wounds, claiming the fighter's vitality could be absorbed through the skin. But the most shocking trade involved the hot blood of freshly slain combatants. Some spectators would rush the arena floor to catch the last spurts from a dying man's wounds, believing it held the ultimate potency. The poet Martial described this macabre scene with disgust, noting how cups were pressed to gashes to collect the precious liquid. Even the fat from corpses was rendered into ointments, turning the Colosseum into a grim apothecary. Why such grotesque faith in bodily fluids? Romans saw gladiators as liminal figures, neither fully alive nor dead, straddling the boundary between worlds. Their blood was considered especially powerful because it was spilled voluntarily in theory, since many were slaves, echoing ancient sacrificial rites. The logic was circular. Since gladiators survived against odds, their very essence must contain magic. This practice wasn't limited to the arena. Athlete sweat from gymnasiums was similarly harvested, and the scrapings from bathhouse floors, a mix of oils, dirt, and skin, were repackaged as gloios, a popular muscle salve. But gladiator remains commanded the highest prices, creating a thriving underground market. Historians speculate that some Lannisti, the managers of gladiator schools, may have even staged fake deaths to harvest more product without losing valuable fighters. The irony is palpable. These same Romans who built aqueducts and pioneered surgery clung to remedies that would make modern scientists shudder. Yet in a world without antibiotics or understanding of germs, the line between medicine and magic was thin. When your child had a fever and a vendor swore a drop of gladiator blood could save them, desperation outweighed skepticism. Today, we'd call this barbaric or exploitative, but to the Romans it was just business. The next time you see a celebrity endorsement for some miracle cure, remember humanity's obsession with quick fixes isn't new. We've just swapped stridules for infomercials, and instead of blood-soaked sand, we have slick TikTok ads. The packaging changes, but the craving for magic in a bottle remains. In Japan, there's a legend that cranes live for 1,000 years, and if you fold 1,000 origami cranes, the gods will grant you a single wish. This tradition, called senbazuru, transforms patience into magic, one delicate fold at a time. The practice dates back centuries, rooted in the belief that cranes symbolize longevity, happiness, and peace. But it wasn't just folklore that cemented this ritual in Japanese culture. The true power of senbazuru was etched into history by a 12-year-old girl named Sadako Sasaki, whose story turned paper cranes into a global symbol of hope. Sadako was just 2 years old when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima in 1945. A decade later, she was diagnosed with leukemia, a cruel consequence of the radiation. As she lay in her hospital bed, a friend reminded her of the old tale: fold 1,000 cranes and the gods would heal her. With whatever paper she could scavenge, medicine wrappers, scrap edges, even other patients' gift wraps, Sadako began folding. Some cranes were no larger than a grain of rice, her fingers trembling with fatigue. She didn't stop at 1,000. By the time she passed away, she'd folded over 1,300, her family stringing them above her bed like a curtain of whispered prayers. Today, Sadako's statue in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park stands draped in countless colorful senbazuru, left by visitors from around the world, but the tradition predates her by centuries. Ancient samurai warriors folded cranes as talismans before battle, believing the birds carried their souls to the afterlife. Brides received senbazuru as wedding gifts, each crane a wish for 1,000 years of marital bliss. The act itself was meditative, a physical manifestation of perseverance. Fold too roughly, and the paper tears rush the process, and the crane loses its elegance. Every crease had to be intentional, a lesson in discipline and grace. What's fascinating is how the cranes are displayed. They're never scattered but strung together on threads, usually 25 to a string, creating a cascading chain of 40 vibrant strands. This wasn't just for aesthetics, the threading symbolized interconnectedness, a visual reminder that wishes, like people, are stronger when linked. Some families passed down senbazuru through generations, adding new cranes to old strings, layering hopes across decades. Modern symposiums have embraced new meanings. They're folded for cancer patients, hung in classrooms after tragedies, or gifted to soldiers deploying overseas. The paper has evolved. Two artisans now use intricately patterned washi or even dollar bills for whimsical twists. But the core remains unchanged, 1,000 acts of patience, 1,000 small rebellions against despair. There's a quiet irony in symposiums. The crane, a creature that supposedly lives a millennium, is rendered in paper, one of the most fragile materials. Yet these delicate creations often outlast their makers, fluttering in temples, hospitals, and memorials long after the folders are gone. Maybe that's the real magic. Not that the gods grant wishes, but that humanity keeps folding them anyway, stubbornly insisting that something as simple as paper can carry the weight of our deepest hopes. For the Celtic warriors of ancient Europe, victory on the battlefield wasn't just measured in territory taken or enemies routed, it was counted in heads. Literally, these fierce fighters didn't merely defeat their foes, they decapitated them, carefully preserving the severed heads as prized trophies. But this wasn't mindless barbarism. To the Celts, the head wasn't just a body part, it was the sacred vessel of the soul, a treasure trove of power, wisdom, and prestige. The process was ritualistic, almost reverent. After a battle, warriors would clean the heads of their fallen enemies, sometimes boiling them to slow decay or rubbing them with cedar oil to preserve the features. The most prestigious heads, those of rival chieftains or renowned fighters, were displayed prominently, nailed to doorposts, hung from chariots, or even mounted on poles outside homes. Greek and Roman writers recoiled at the sight. The historian Diodorus Siculus described Celtic warriors dangling heads from their horses' necks, the grisly trophies swinging with every gallop. Strabo went further, claiming some heads were so cherished they were stored in chests and brought out only for special occasions like heirlooms of war. But why this obsession with heads? Celtic mythology held that the soul resided in the skull, and by possessing an enemy's head, a warrior could absorb their strength, courage, and even their knowledge. Some legends speak of talking heads, whispering prophecies, or revealing secrets long after death. The famous story of Bran the Blessed, a Welsh king, tells how his own severed head continued to guide and protect his people for decades, its presence warding off disaster. Archaeology confirms the practice wasn't just legend. At sites like in Tremont in southern France, stone pillars were found carved with niches designed to hold skulls, their hollow eyes staring blankly across centuries. In Britain, the so-called head cult left behind skulls ritually placed in springs or buried beneath forts, possibly as offerings to the gods. Even in death, these heads held power, guardians of the land, protectors of the people. What unsettles modern minds most isn't just the violence, but the intimacy of it. These weren't anonymous trophies. The Celts took pains to preserve the faces, keeping the identities of their enemies alive. A severed head wasn't just a symbol of conquest, it was a conversation, a way to humiliate the vanquished while stealing their essence. Some scholars suggest the practice may have roots in older Neolithic traditions, where skulls of ancestors were kept as talismans, blurring the line between reverence and dominance. The Romans, of course, saw it as pure savagery. Yet in a grim twist, they borrowed the symbolism, displaying the heads of executed criminals on Rome's bridges as warnings. The Celts, though, didn't use heads to terrorize, they used them to transform. A warrior who collected enough heads didn't just prove his bravery, he stacked the deck of fate in his favor, weaving the strength of his foes into his own legend. Today, the practice feels unthinkable, but its echoes linger. From the phrase, losing your head, to the enduring power of skulls in art and symbolism, we're still captivated by the idea that the head holds something more than flesh and bone. The Celts just took it literally. For them, every battle was a hunt not just for victory, but for the very souls of those who dared oppose them. high in the thin, frigid air of the Andes, where the wind howls like a grieving spirit and the snow never melts, lie some of history's most haunting offerings, children frozen in time. The Inca called this ritual capacocha, a sacrifice so profound it blurred the line between brutality and reverence. These weren't random victims plucked from obscurity. They were the empire's most beautiful, healthiest children, chosen as gifts to the gods, their deaths believed to maintain cosmic order. The selection process was meticulous. Communities across the empire would present their finest boys and girls, often as young as 6, to imperial inspectors. Only the unblemished were chosen, no scars, no illnesses, no imperfections. These children were then taken to Cusco, the heart of the Inca world, where they participated in lavish ceremonies, feasted like royalty, and even met the Sopa Inca himself. To modern eyes, it sounds like a cruel deception, but the Inca saw it differently. These children weren't just dying, they were becoming huacas, sacred beings who would forever stand between the mortal world and the divine. The journey to the sacrificial sites was its own ordeal. Priests and attendants led the children, sometimes dozens at a time, up slopes so steep and icy that modern climbers struggle with the same routes today. At altitudes surpassing 20,000 feet, the air grew thin and the cold bit deep, but the Inca didn't rely on the elements alone to claim their offerings. Forensic evidence from preserved mummies reveals a chilling detail. Many children were given chicha, a fermented maize beer laced with coca leaves and other hallucinogens. Their final moments were likely a haze of warmth and visions, their bodies numbed to the creeping freeze. Some were strangled with finely woven cords, their bodies arranged in fetal positions as if returning to the womb of the earth. Others were simply left to succumb to the cold, tucked into stone shrines with gold figurines, textiles, and shells as companions for the afterlife. The most famous of these sacrifices, the Loco maiden, was found in 1999 atop a volcano in Argentina. Her face still frozen in a serene expression, her braids perfectly intact, her ceremonial dress vibrant despite 5 centuries. It's as if time itself paused to honor her. Why such extreme measures? The Inca believed mountains were living gods, Apu, who controlled weather, fertility, and fate. A sacrificed child wasn't a victim but a messenger, an eternal intermediary ensuring the gods' favor. Droughts, earthquakes, even the stability of the empire, these were thought to hinge on the capacocha, and it worked. After major sacrifices, the Inca noted bountiful harvests, mild seasons, and victorious battles, reinforcing their faith in the ritual's power. What's perhaps most unsettling is how little fear these children seem to have felt. Toxicology reports show months of elite treatment, diets rich in protein, coca leaves to ease altitude sickness, even traces of ayahuasca in some cases. They weren't dragged screaming to their deaths but prepared, honored, and revered. In a world where the sacred and the savage walked hand in hand, the capacocha wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of faith, a belief so strong it could send children into the clouds, forever watching over the empire from the peaks where heaven touched earth. Today, their mummies stare back at us, their lips parted as if whispering secrets we'll never fully understand. They remind us that every civilization draws its own line between sacrifice and salvation, and sometimes that line is etched in ice. In the dust-choked courtyards of ancient Mesopotamia, where kings ruled by the whims of gods, the future wasn't guessed, it was carved from the flesh of sheep. Priests with blood-streaked robes and knives sharper than betrayal would slice open sacrificial animals, not for meat, but to read the secrets of the universe in the glistening lobes of their livers. This practice, called hepatoscopy, wasn't some fringe superstition. It was the cornerstone of statecraft, a sacred science that shaped wars, treaties, and even the fate of dynasties. The ritual followed a script as precise as it was gruesome. A flawless sheep, often white without a single blemish, would be led before the temple altar. Its throat was slit with a ceremonial blade, and as the life drained from its eyes, the baru or diviner would extract the liver with hands steady as a scribe's. What happened next was part autopsy, part celestial cartography. The liver, believed to be the seat of emotion and divine connection, was studied like a clay tablet inscribed by the gods themselves. Every bump, groove, and discoloration held meaning. A cleft in the right lobe might warn of famine, while an unusually shaped gallbladder could signal an enemy's betrayal. What's staggering is how systematized this was. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of liver models, clay replicas used for training, each marked with annotations like region of prosperity or zone of pestilence. Some even bore cuneiform labels mimicking the cracks and spots a priest might encounter. These weren't vague interpretations, they were a coded language, a divine Google Translate turning organ quirks into actionable intel. One famous tablet from Mari warns King Zimri limb against marching to war because a liver's path of the enemy was darkened advice he ignored only to lose his throne. But why livers? Mesopotamians saw them as microcosms of the cosmos, mirrors reflecting the moods of gods like Enlil or Ishtar. Unlike bones or stars, livers were mutable, changing in real time with the deity's whims. The process was so trusted that no military campaign, marriage alliance, or even building project began without it. When the Assyrian king Esarhaddon fell ill, hepatoscopy wasn't just consulted. It dictated which herbs to administer, which sins to atone for, even which courtier to blame. The darkest twist, sometimes the livers spoke too clearly. Texts describe silent organs, one so ominously smooth they offered no clues, a sign the gods had turned away. In these cases, additional sacrifices were made until the liver spoke, a grim reminder that divinity demanded persistence. Modern medicine might scoff, but consider this. The liver's role in filtering toxins means it does change with environment and health. Maybe the baru weren't entirely wrong, just reading the wrong chapter of biology. Either way, their legacy lingers. The word haruspex, Roman liver readers, comes from the same tradition, and even today we say gut feelings when deciding our futures. The Mesopotamians just took it literally, trusting a sheep's liver over their own instincts, convinced that the divine was always one incision away from revelation. On the fog-shrouded battlefields of the Viking Age, warriors clad in wolf pelts and bear skins charged ahead of their brethren, howling like wild beasts, their eyes glazed with a fury so intense it left enemies frozen in terror. These weren't ordinary fighters, they were berserkers, the ultimate shock troops of Norse legend. But their legendary rage wasn't purely psychological. Historians now believe these warriors tapped into something far more potent, a cocktail of hallucinogenic mushrooms and ritual trance that transformed them into nearly unstoppable forces of nature. The key to their frenzy may have lain in a small, unassuming mushroom called Amanita muscaria, the iconic red and white speckled toadstool found across Scandinavia. When ingested, its psychoactive compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, induce effects eerily similar to berserker descriptions, distorted perceptions, superhuman strength, and a terrifying indifference to pain. Norse sagas speak of warriors who bit their shields like rabid dogs, who fought on despite gaping wounds, and who collapsed into days-long comas after battle, symptoms that align disturbingly well with modern accounts of mushroom poisoning. But this wasn't reckless self-destruction. Berserkers likely prepared for their trances through elaborate rituals. Before battle, they may have fasted or consumed the mushrooms with fat-rich foods to mitigate nausea, then donned their animal pelts to psychologically become the beast whose spirits they channeled. The Ynglinga saga describes Odin's elite warriors as mad as dogs or wolves, strong as bears or bulls, suggesting their transformation was as much spiritual as chemical. Some scholars argue berserkers also used repetitive chanting, rhythmic drumming, or even self-inflicted pain to heighten their altered states, practices mirrored in Siberian shamanic traditions where Amanita was sacred. The aftermath, however, was anything but glorious. Come-downs from such doses would leave warriors drained, disoriented, and vulnerable, explaining why berserkers were often kept apart from normal society. The Egil saga recounts one warrior who, after a battle rage, murdered 7 men in his own camp before collapsing. This duality made them both feared and ostracized, useful weapons but too volatile to trust. Modern experiments hint at why the berserker tradition faded. While Amanita can induce aggression, its effects are wildly unpredictable. Some users experience euphoria, others paralyzing nausea or terrifying hallucinations. As Viking societies Christianized and organized into standing armies, the uncontrollable fury of berserkers became less an asset and more a liability. By the 12th century, laws in Norway explicitly banned berserker behavior, marking the end of an era when mushrooms and madness could turn the tide of battle. Yet their legacy lingers. The word berserk still means unstoppable rage, and modern soldiers sometimes speak of combat flow, that trance-like state where training overrides fear. The berserkers just had a more organic way of getting there. Next time you see that fairy tale toadstool in a storybook, remember, its real history is far darker, soaked in the sweat and blood of warriors who walked the knife's edge between man and monster. In the golden glow of Egyptian funeral processions, grief wasn't just felt, it was performed, loud enough to reach the ears of the gods. When a wealthy noble or pharaoh passed into the afterlife, their family didn't weep quietly. They summoned professional mourners, women whose job was to unleash torrents of screams, tear their garments to shreds, and smear their faces with dust in displays of sorrow so visceral they could shake the walls of nearby tombs. These weren't mere theatrics. To the ancient Egyptians, mourning was a sacred obligation, and the louder the lamentations, the more certain the deceased soul would hear its worth reflected back. The rituals followed strict choreography. As the mummy was carried toward its tomb, the hired wailers, often clad in plain blue linen to symbolize sorrow, would form a frenzied procession behind the coffin. Arms raised to the sky, they'd chant dirges in piercing voices, their words a mix of poetic tributes and raw pleas. "O Westerners, the dead, why have you taken him? Return him even for a day." Some would rip their hair out by the roots or slash their cheeks with fingernails, leaving trails of blood to mingle with their tears. The more dramatic the display, the more the family's devotion was proven, and the more the gods took notice. But why outsource grief? In a society where the afterlife was a meticulously planned journey, every emotional beat had purpose. The professional wailers, called kites or MWW, meaning mothers of lament, were considered intermediaries between the living and the dead. Their cries weren't just noise, they were spells, sonic bridges to Juat, the realm of Osiris. Wall paintings in tombs like those of Ramesses III show rows of mourners with mouths grotesquely wide, their anguish frozen in pigment, a reminder that sorrow, too, could be etched into eternity. The best mourners commanded hefty fees, their skills passed down through generations. Some were so renowned they traveled between cities, their presence at a funeral as coveted as the finest burial linens. Contracts discovered in Thebes even stipulate payment terms, so many jars of grain or lengths of cloth for a specific duration of wailing, and it wasn't just noise. The kites memorized intricate laments tailored to the deceased's status. A farmer might merit simpler chants, while a vizier's dirges could last for days. Archaeologists have found traces of this practice in the most unexpected places. Bundles of torn cloth buried near tombs, their frayed edges suggesting violent ripping. Small blue beads scattered in burial shafts, likely from mourners' garments. Even the mummies themselves tell a story. Some show traces of salt on their wrappings, possibly from the tears of wailers who leaned too close. What's haunting is how little the practice has changed. Today, in parts of Upper Egypt, professional mourners still chant at funerals, their voices rising in the same cadences used 3,000 years ago. The tools might differ. Modern cell phones sometimes amplify their cries, but the intent remains: to carve a path through grief so piercing, even the gods can't look away. For the ancient Egyptians, mourning wasn't private. It was a collective roar against silence, proof that some bonds refused to break, even in death. For 17 riotous days each December, Rome's rigid social order didn't just bend, it shattered. The Saturnalia festival turned the empire upside down with a kind of sanctioned anarchy that would make modern holiday parties seem tame by comparison. This wasn't just a few drunken toasts, it was a full-scale societal role reversal where enslaved people dined in luxury while their masters served them, where gambling dens thrived openly in the streets, and where even the sternest senators could be seen stumbling home at dawn wearing ridiculous hats. The festivities honored Saturn, the god of agriculture and time, but the real star was chaos itself. The first public act set the tone. A priest would cry, "Io Saturnalia," before removing the woolen bands from the god's statue, symbolizing the loosening of all restraints. What followed was a cascade of subversion. Enslaved individuals were not merely given a day off, they were treated as equals, reclining at banquets while their owners brought them wine. Some masters even handed over their distinctive red pileus caps, the very symbol of freedmen's liberty, as temporary tokens of emancipation. The poet Catullus called it the best of days, a time when the whole mob becomes equal, if only briefly. Gambling, usually illegal for all but soldiers during campaign season, became not just permitted but expected. Romans of every class crowded around makeshift dice boards in the forum, their coins clinking between raucous laughter. Even the straight-laced Cotto the Younger was said to relax his moralizing during Saturnalia, though he likely still kept his toga impeccably draped. The air smelled of roasting pork and spiced wine, the latter flowing so freely that public drunkenness wasn't just tolerated, it was practically mandatory. Costumes completed the carnival atmosphere. Citizens donned brightly colored synthesis robes usually reserved for private dinners, while others wore grotesque masks or dressed in the short tunics of enslaved people, relishing the chance to play act across class lines. No one was safe from mockery. Elected officials were subjected to satirical songs, and according to the historian Suetonius, even Emperor Augustus once got into the spirit by distributing gag gifts like 12-pound hams or inscriptions promising absurd favors. Yet beneath the revelry lay serious social engineering. By allowing these controlled explosions of disorder, Rome's elite subtly reinforced the stability of the hierarchy the rest of the year. Like a pressure valve on a boiling kettle, Saturnalia gave the disenfranchised a taste of freedom just potent enough to prevent full revolt. The enslaved knew their elevated status was temporary. Come December 18th, the woolen bonds went back on Saturn's statue, and so did society's shackles. Modern echoes of Saturnalia linger in our own year-end traditions: office parties where interns sit in the boss's chair, secret gift exchanges where hierarchy dissolves in laughter. But Rome's festival dared to go further, proving that sometimes the deepest order comes from carefully choreographed chaos. The true miracle wasn't that masters served slaves for a week, but that when the sun rose on the 18th, everyone obediently went back to their places until the next December, when the world would flip once more. In the flickering light of a funeral pyre, amidst the choking smoke and the wails of mourners, some Hindu widows made the ultimate choice, or had it made for them. Sati, the fiery ritual where a woman would climb onto her husband's burning pyre to join him in death, remains one of history's most haunting and misunderstood customs. To outsiders, it seemed like sheer barbarism, but within the context of its time, it was framed as the highest act of wifely devotion, a sacrifice so pure it could cleanse sins and elevate entire families. The practice's origins are murky, tangled in myth and contested history. Early Hindu texts like the Rig Veda mention widows lying beside their dead husbands, but not necessarily burning alive. By the medieval period, however, sati had evolved into a full-blown spectacle, especially among Rajput royalty in northern India. Chroniclers describe queens adorned in wedding finery, their palms painted with henna as if for a marriage ceremony, walking calmly toward flames in front of cheering crowds. Some accounts insist these women acted willingly, even joyfully, believing they'd reunite with their spouses in the afterlife. Others tell darker tales of widows drugged, bound, or coerced by relatives eager to claim their inheritance or avoid the shame of supporting them. The justifications were as complex as they were chilling. Proponents argued sati ensured a widow's spiritual purity, sparing her from a life of celibacy or worse remarriage, which some Hindu scriptures condemned. A woman who performed sati was worshipped as a sati mata, a saint-like figure whose courage supposedly brought blessings to her village for generations. Temples still stand today where these women are venerated, their names etched in stone alongside claims of miracles, but peel back the legend and you'll find grim realities. Widows in traditional Hindu society often faced brutal ostracism, shunned, shaved-headed, and forced into menial labor. For some, the pyre may have felt like the lesser of two horrors. Colonial records from the British Raj reveal just how politicized sati became. While early missionaries decried it as pagan cruelty, many Hindu reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy spearheaded the abolition movement from within, arguing the practice distorted scripture. The turning point came in 1829 when Governor-General Lord William Bentinck banned sati across British India, calling it revolting to humanity. But enforcement was patchy and underground cases persisted for decades, particularly in remote regions where tradition held sway. What's often overlooked is how sati's legacy still smolders today. In rare, tragic incidents like the 1987 case of Roop Kanwar in Rajasthan, modern sati death sparked national outcry, exposing tensions between progress and deep-seated belief. Her pyre drew thousands of devotees before authorities intervened, a stark reminder of how ancient ideals can erupt violently into the present. The debate lingers: was sati ever truly voluntary, or was it a cultural noose disguised as devotion? Perhaps the answer lies in the ashes themselves, silent witnesses to a practice that blurred the line between sacrifice and subjugation, between a woman's choice and the weight of 1,000 years of expectation. On the storm-lashed shores of the Pacific Northwest, where cedar plank houses faced the churning ocean, a different kind of battle raged, one fought not with spears but with blankets, canoes, and the audacious crack of a copper shield being shattered. This was the potlatch, a ceremony so extravagant it turned generosity into a weapon and destruction into the ultimate power move. For tribes like the Kwakiutl, Haida, and Tlingit, wealth wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was a living thing to be flaunted, given away, or even obliterated in a blaze of calculated spectacle. The word potlatch comes from the Chinook jargon meaning to give, but these events were anything but simple charity. Imagine a days-long feast where a chief would heap mountains of dried salmon, stacks of animal pelts, and hand-carved cedar boxes filled with ulachan oil, a precious commodity nicknamed grease of the gods, onto towering gift piles for rivals. Guests weren't just fed, they were buried under gifts, each item a deliberate jab at the receiver's status. The more you gave, the more you proved your ability to command resources, labor, and loyalty. Some chiefs distributed so many blankets that entire villages left with armfuls, their backs bent under the weight of their host's superiority. But the real power plays came in the finale. To truly humiliate rivals, hosts would sometimes destroy their most prized possessions in front of everyone. A chief might take a ceremonial copper shield, a symbol of wealth so potent it had its own name and lineage, and smash it or toss a fortune in carved bracelets into the fire. This wasn't madness, it was economic warfare. By destroying what others coveted, you proved you could always acquire more. One 19th century account describes a Kwakiutl leader burning his house and canoes, then casually rebuilding them months later just to flaunt his limitless resources. European colonizers were baffled, missionaries called it wasteful, and Canadian authorities outright banned potlatches from 1884 to 1951, fearing these displays undermined Western capitalism. But they'd missed the point entirely. In a society without written ledgers or banks, potlatches were living records of debts, alliances, and status. A chief's reputation hinged on memory. Did he give more than his father? Did that rival's gifts outshine his last potlatch? Oral histories recount feuds spanning generations, where one family's epic giveaway demanded an even grander response years later. The banned years forced potlatches underground, where they persisted in secret, disguised as Christmas parties or memorials. Today, revived potlatches remain potent, though the currency has shifted. Now you might see iPads or cash stacked beside traditional carvings. Yet the core endures. In a world obsessed with accumulation, these communities remember that true wealth isn't what you keep, but what you let go. When a carved totem pole is raised or a mountain of gifts redistributed, it echoes an ancient truth. That power at its heart is about who can afford to lose the most. High atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the air hummed with the scent of laurel and sulfur, sat the most powerful woman in ancient Greece, and she wasn't even a queen. The Pythia, oracle of Delphi, perched on a three-legged stool above a chasm in the earth, breathing in vapors that twisted her mind into a conduit for the god Apollo. Kings, generals, and philosophers trekked for miles to kneel before her, desperate for a glimpse of the future, even if it came shrouded in riddles that could topple empires or spark wars. The ritual was as precise as it was eerie. After purifying herself in the Castalian spring, the Pythia, chosen from among Delphi's priestesses, would descend into the temple's inner sanctum, the Aditon. There, she'd seat herself above a fissure in the rock where volcanic gases seeped from the earth. Ancient sources describe a sweet, nauseating odor, likely ethylene or benzene. Modern scientists suggest that sent her into a trance. As her body convulsed and her voice distorted, priests would translate her rasping, fragmented phrases into hexameter verse, crafting prophecies as slippery as they were sacred. One famous example changed the course of history. When King Croesus of Lydia asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle replied, "If you cross the river Halys, a great empire will fall." He did, and it was his empire that crumbled, not Persia's. The Pythia's words were never lies, but they thrived on double meanings, forcing seekers to wrestle with their own assumptions. Even Socrates cited her as the source of his famous maxim, "Know thyself," a Delphic inscription that reminded visitors that wisdom often lay in interpretation, not absolutes. But the oracle's power wasn't just spiritual, it was geopolitical. City-states consulted her before founding colonies, and generals postponed battles based on her whispers. When Athens faced Persian invasion in 480 BC, the Pythia initially predicted doom. Flee to the ends of the earth. Yet after bribes and pleading, she offered a second prophecy, hinting at a wooden wall that would save them. The statesman Themistocles interpreted this as naval ships, leading to Athens' victory at Salamis. Delphi wasn't just a shrine, it was an ancient spin room where ambiguity served as both shield and weapon. The science behind the Pythia's trances fascinates modern researchers. Geological surveys confirm 2 fault lines cross beneath the temple, releasing traces of intoxicating gases. Ethylene, known for inducing euphoria and altered speech, fits ancient accounts of her rapturous state. Yet the gas's effects were unpredictable, sometimes visions, sometimes delirium, occasionally death. Not every Pythia survived the role, and replacements were kept on standby, a grim reminder that communing with gods came at a price. By the Roman era, the oracle's influence waned. Emperors like Nero looted Delphi's treasures, and early Christians scorned her as a pagan relic. But for nearly 1,000 years, she'd been the chaotic heartbeat of the Mediterranean, a reminder that humans would gamble anything for a whisper of certainty, even if that certainty was woven from poison and paradox. The Pythia's legacy endures in our own obsessions with prediction, from astrology to algorithms. We still crave oracles. We've just swapped vapors for data and priestesses for influencers. The medium changes, but the desperation remains, to hear the future, however twisted, and believe we can outsmart it. On the wind-scoured plateaus of Tibet and the high deserts of Mongolia, death wasn't buried or burned, it took flight. For centuries, Tibetan Buddhists and Mongolian Zoroastrians practiced sky burial, a ritual where the deceased were carried to remote mountain peaks, stripped of flesh by vultures, their bones left to bleach in the sun. To outsiders, it might seem brutal, but to these cultures, it was the purest form of farewell, a liberation of the soul through total surrender to nature. The process was deliberate, almost reverent. After death, the body was wrapped in white cloth and kept for days as monks chanted prayers to guide the soul. No knives touched the flesh, purity was paramount. Then the Rogiopas, or body breakers, would carry the deceased to a designated sky burial site, often a flat rock high above human settlements. There, they'd unwrap the body and use ritual axes to dismember it, scattering the pieces to summon vultures. These birds, known as dakinis or sky dancers, were seen not as scavengers but as divine messengers, ferrying the soul to heaven. If the vultures consumed every scrap, it meant the person had lived virtuously. Leftovers signaled sin, requiring more prayers. Zoroastrians in Mongolia shared this practice, though their reasoning differed. They believed corpses contaminated the sacred elements earth, fire, water, and that sky burial prevented spiritual pollution. Towers of silence, circular stone platforms where bodies were exposed, dotted their landscapes. Both traditions agreed on one thing: returning the body directly to the cycle of life was the ultimate act of humility and ecological harmony. Modern science reveals a chilling practicality behind the poetry. High-altitude terrain made digging graves nearly impossible in frozen soil, and scarce firewood made cremation impractical for most. Vultures, nature's most efficient cleaners, could strip a body in hours, preventing disease in isolated communities. Yet the spiritual symbolism ran deeper. Tibetan Buddhists viewed the body as an empty vessel after death. Clinging to it through burial or preservation only trapped the soul. Letting it vanish into the beaks of vultures was akin to blowing out a candle, releasing the light within. The ritual's fragility hit hard in recent decades. Vulture populations across Asia crashed by 99% due to livestock drugs like diclofenac, forcing some sky burials to stall for days, awaiting scarce birds. Tibetan families now sometimes resort to cremation, a painful compromise for a tradition spanning millennia. Yet in remote regions the practice endures, a stark reminder that death, in its rawest form, can be both brutal and beautiful, a pact between humans and the wild, where the end of one life feeds the beginning of countless others. What unsettles Western observers most isn't the violence of the act, but its honesty. Sky burial rejects the sanitized death of coffins and embalming, confronting us with nature's truth, that we are, in the end, just another link in the chain. The vultures don't mourn or moralize, they simply complete the circle, turning grief into wings and flesh into flight. In the bustling markets of ancient Babylon, where merchants haggled over bolts of linen and sacks of grain, there was one annual auction that drew crowds like no other: the sale of brides. Every spring, the city's unmarried women gathered in the public square, not to meet suitors casually, but to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Beauty was the currency here. The most striking women fetched staggering sums, while those deemed less desirable were practically given away, sometimes for as little as a handful of silver. But this wasn't just a spectacle of vanity or greed. It was a meticulously regulated system designed to ensure every woman, regardless of looks, could secure a husband. The process was coldly efficient. Women were lined up and paraded before a throng of eager bidders, their worth assessed with the same detachment as livestock. Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled the practice, described how auctions proceeded in strict order, starting with the most beautiful and working down to the plainest. Wealthy men would duel with escalating bids, driving prices to dizzying heights for the fairest maidens. The winners walked away with brides while the losers moved on to the next lot, hoping for a bargain. But here's the twist: the profits from these high-stakes sales didn't line the pockets of the state or the families. Instead, the windfall was pooled to fund dowries for the women at the bottom of the beauty hierarchy, those who might otherwise never attract a bid at all. At first glance, this might seem like a crude welfare system, but the deeper logic was rooted in Babylonian notions of fairness and social stability. Without dowries, less attractive women, or those from poor families faced bleak prospects, spinsterhood, poverty, or even servitude. By redistributing wealth from the desirable to the disadvantaged, the auctions acted as a brutal yet effective equalizer. Even the poorest father could rest assured his daughter wouldn't be left behind simply because she lacked the right features. Yet the system wasn't without its dark ironies. While it ostensibly protected women from destitution, it also reduced them to commodities, their value quantified in coins and contracts. There's no record of what the women themselves thought, whether some relished the competition or resented being priced like pottery. What we do know is that escape was nearly impossible. Refusing to participate meant opting out of marriage entirely, a social death sentence in a culture where a woman's status hinged on her role as a wife and mother. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. In an era of dating apps and influencer culture, where algorithms quietly rank attractiveness and market forces still shape romantic destinies, Babylon's auctions feel uncomfortably familiar. We might not gather in town squares to bid openly, but the underlying calculus where beauty translates to advantage hasn't vanished, it's just gone digital. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from Herodotus himself. In his accounts, he notes that some Babylonian communities later abandoned the practice, finding it too uncivilized. Yet for centuries it worked. Marriages were made, families formed, and societies held together not by love or chance, but by the ruthless efficiency of supply and demand. The brides of Babylon remind us that throughout history, marriage has rarely been just a matter of the heart. Sometimes it's a transaction with all the bargaining, inequities, and compromises that come with it. In the dim, flickering light of a medieval church, a trembling accused thief would grip a white-hot iron rod, his fate resting not on evidence or testimony, but on whether God saw fit to spare his flesh from burning. This was trial by ordeal, a legal practice where pain became the ultimate lie detector, and divine intervention served as judge and jury. Across Europe between the 9th and 13th centuries, communities turned to these brutal rituals when facts were scarce and suspicion ran high. The logic was chillingly simple. If you were innocent, God would perform a miracle to protect you. If guilty, your body would betray you. The most common form, the ordeal of hot iron, followed a precise script. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, the accused would carry a scorching metal bar, sometimes heated until it glowed, for a set distance, usually 9 feet. Their hand was then bandaged and inspected 3 days later. Clean healing meant divine favor, festering wounds confirmed guilt, variations abounded. In the ordeal of boiling water, suspects plunged their arm into a cauldron to retrieve a stone, the depth of the burns deciding their fate. For those of higher status, there was the ordeal of the morsel. Choking on a blessed piece of bread meant perjury, while swallowing cleanly proved truthfulness. What's startling is how deeply these trials were embedded in Christian theology. Priests officiated the ceremonies, blessing the irons or waters with prayers like, "May this heat be as a purgatory to thee, if guilty, but harmless if innocent." The ordeal wasn't seen as superstition but as sacramental, a direct line to divine judgment. Even the timing mattered. Ordeals were often scheduled for holy days when God's attention was presumed closest. Yet behind the piety lay grim pragmatism. Without forensic science or centralized policing, medieval communities needed a system to resolve disputes that everyone would accept as final. An ordeal's public, visceral nature made it a powerful deterrent. Watching a neighbor's flesh sear or seeing them sink in freezing water, a sign of guilt in the cold water ordeal, reinforced social order through sheer terror. Some historians argue these trials also functioned as psychological pressure valves, allowing accusers to back down without losing face if the accused willingly underwent the test. The practice's flaws were obvious even then. Wealthy suspects could sometimes negotiate lighter punishments or pay for substitutes, while the poor faced the full brunt. Church reformers like Peter the Chanter openly questioned how a merciful God would condone such violence, and by the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council banned clerical involvement, effectively ending most ordeals. Secular courts turned instead to jury trials and torture, methods arguably no less brutal but at least nominally rooted in human judgment. What lingers most isn't just the brutality but the raw faith it exposed. These weren't witch hunts fueled by hysteria, but solemn ceremonies where entire villages trusted God to literally hold the hot iron. In a world where the divine felt tangibly present, perhaps the real ordeal wasn't the pain, it was the unbearable weight of believing your own body could become a testament to the unknowable will of heaven. In the quiet corners of Japanese Buddhist temples, rows of tiny stone statues stand in silent vigil, their round faces and bibs untouched by time. These are Mizuko Jizo, the guardians of lost children, and the centerpiece of a ritual called Mizuko Kuyo, a ceremony for parents mourning babies who never took a first breath. Unlike Western traditions that often leave pregnancy loss unspoken, this practice gives form to grief, transforming private sorrow into something tangible, even sacred. The ritual begins with the purchase or commissioning of a Jizo statue, typically depicted as a child monk with an expression of serene compassion. These figures are dressed in tiny handmade bibs or hats, often red, the color of protection in Japanese culture, and given offerings of sweets, toys, or coins. Parents might write letters to their lost child, tying them to the statue, or pour water over it in a symbolic act of cleansing and care. Some temples hold annual memorial services where families gather to chant sutras, the air thick with incense and unspoken longing. But Mizuko Kuyo is more than memorial, it's rooted in complex spiritual beliefs. Buddhism teaches that souls who die too young become Mizuko, or water children, stranded in a liminal realm called Sai no Kawara, a riverbank where they must stack stones into towers only for demons to knock them down. Jizo intervenes, hiding the children in his robes and guiding them across the spiritual divide. By honoring these statues, parents hope to ease their child's journey and their own guilt. In a society where abortion, though legal, carries moral weight, the ritual also serves as an act of atonement, a way to say, "You existed, you mattered." The practice surged in post-war Japan as urbanization and economic pressure led to more abortions. Temples began offering specialized Mizuko Kuyo services, some controversially monetizing grief with high fees for statues or prayers. Critics argue this commercializes loss, while others see it as meeting a profound need, giving women a space to mourn in a culture that often silences such pain. What's striking is how Mizuko Kuyo blends the personal and communal. Unlike Western grief, often shouldered alone, here sorrow is shared not just with Jizo, but with other parents who leave offerings or tend forgotten statues. The bibs fade in the sun, the sweets are eaten by birds, but the ritual persists, a quiet rebellion against forgetting. Modern adaptations have emerged too. Online Jizo memorials allow virtual offerings, while some artists create glass or crystal statues, refracting light into colors no child lived to see. These innovations raise questions. Is grief diluted when it's digitized, or does it simply find new forms? Perhaps the most poignant detail is this: some jizo wear multiple bibs, layered by different visitors over years. A single statue might bear the grief of countless strangers, their losses overlapping like ripples in a pond. In a world that often dismisses early loss as a small sadness, the statues insist otherwise, that love, not time, determines the weight of a life. In the golden heat of an Egyptian summer, as the Nile's floodwaters receded and the harvest season neared, villagers gathered for a rite of passage that would mark their children forever, not with crowns or titles, but with blood and blade. Circumcision, performed on both boys and girls, wasn't a quiet medical procedure tucked behind closed doors. It was a public spectacle, a cacophony of music, dancing, and feasting that transformed pain into celebration and bodily alteration into a badge of honor. For boys, the ritual typically struck around puberty, though some temple reliefs suggest it could happen as early as 6 years old. The ceremony began with purification, bathing in sacred waters, anointing with oils before the child was led before the community. Skilled priests, not physicians, wielded the flint or bronze knives, their precision honed through generations. There were no anesthetics, only the rhythmic thumping of drums and the chants of onlookers meant to drown out cries. The foreskin, once removed, was sometimes preserved in honey or buried ritually, a symbolic offering to the gods. Girls' circumcision, though less documented, was no less significant. Wall paintings in the tomb of the physician at Saqqara depict young women undergoing the procedure, their clitorises ritually nicked or partially removed. Unlike boys, girls often endured this in smaller, women-only gatherings overseen by priestesses or elder female relatives. The act was framed as a purification, a removal of masculine traits to ensure fertility and marital harmony. The aftermath was as important as the cut itself. Families hosted lavish feasts, presenting the children with amulets of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, or Bes, the dwarf god who warded off evil. Music swirled through the streets, and the newly circumcised were paraded in linen garments, their wounds dressed with antiseptic mixtures of honey and willow bark. To outsiders like the Greek historian Herodotus, it seemed barbaric, but to Egyptians this was divine order, a physical covenant with the gods as vital as mummification for the afterlife. What's often overlooked is the psychological dimension. These weren't clandestine acts of control, but celebrated milestones, woven into myths like the tale of the god Ra, who circumcised himself to shed blood that birthed lesser deities. The pain was intentional, a trial by fire that proved one's readiness for adult responsibilities. Temple schools even used the ritual as a teaching moment, linking bodily discipline to moral purity. Yet the practice wasn't universal. Lower classes sometimes opted for simpler ceremonies, while royals turned it into state theater. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III commissioned reliefs boasting of mass circumcisions for hundreds of boys, a display of piety and power. The divide between genders was stark, though. Boys' circumcision was publicly glorified, girls' was whispered, a private pain masked by communal revelry. Modern excavations have uncovered flint blades still flecked with dried blood, and medical papyri detail post-procedure care, proving this wasn't blind tradition but a calculated practice. Some mummies show clean, healed scars, evidence of skilled hands, while others bear the ragged marks of infection, a reminder that even sacred rituals carried risks. Today, these ceremonies seem unthinkable, yet their legacy lingers. The very word circumcision comes from the Latin circumcidere, but the concept was perfected by the Nile's scalpel-wielding priests. What fascinates isn't just the act, but the paradox. A culture that revered bodily perfection willingly marked its children, turning them into living temples of faith. The cuts healed, but the message endured. Sometimes, to belong to the divine, you must first shed a piece of yourself. From the moment a Roman boy took his first breath, his life was marked by more than just family lineage. It was safeguarded by a small, gleaming charm dangling from his neck. The bulla, a hollow locket typically made of gold for the wealthy or lead for the poor, was no mere decoration. Filled with protective herbs, amulets, or even fragments of scripture, it served as a spiritual shield, warding off the ever-present threat of evil spirits and the evil eye. This wasn't just superstition, it was a rite of passage woven into the very fabric of Roman identity, a visible declaration that this child belonged not just to his family, but to the gods who watched over him. The bulla's journey began 9 days after birth during the dies lustricus, a purification ceremony where the newborn was officially named and welcomed into the household. As relatives gathered to celebrate, the father would place the bulla around the baby's neck, its rounded shape symbolizing both the womb's safety and the cyclical protection of the divine. For wealthier families, the bulla might be intricately engraved with images of gods like Jupiter or Mars, while simpler versions bore geometric patterns or the family's crest. What mattered wasn't the material, but the promise it carried, that no harm would befall the child while the charm remained close. As the boy grew, the bulla became a second skin, worn during play, study, and even sleep. It was a constant reminder of vulnerability, not just to physical dangers, but to the unseen forces Romans believed lurked in every shadow. Misfortune, illness, or even a sudden fright could be blamed on malevolent spirits, and the bulla acted as a first line of defense. Parents took its power seriously. There are accounts of boys forbidden from leaving home if their bulla was misplaced, lest they tempt fate unprotected. The climax of this tradition came with the arrival of adulthood, usually between 14 and 17 years old. During the lavish Liberalia festival, the young man would stand before his family's household shrine, remove the bulla for the last time, and lay it at the feet of the lares, the guardian spirits of the home. This act wasn't just symbolic, it was a transactional moment, a returning of borrowed grace. By offering the bulla, the boy acknowledged that his childhood protections were no longer needed. He was now a man capable of facing the world's dangers with his own strength and the gods' continued favor. Yet the bulla's influence didn't end there. Some families preserved the charms as heirlooms, passing them down to future generations like ancestral blessings. Others buried them beneath doorways or thresholds, transforming them into permanent wards for the household. For military leaders or politicians, the bulla might even be donned again in moments of crisis, a tangible plea for divine intervention in times of war or political turmoil. What's striking is how the bulla bridged the personal and the communal. While it guarded individual boys, it also reinforced societal values: respect for tradition, reverence for the gods, and the collective responsibility to shield the vulnerable. Even emperors weren't exempt. Augustus famously wore his bulla during times of illness, proving that no amount of power could render a man immune to fear. Today, echoes of the bulla live on in traditions like Catholic baptismal medals or Jewish hamsa necklaces, reminders that the instinct to protect the young transcends time. The Romans just made it literal, encasing their hopes in metal and string, trusting that something so small could hold back the darkness. In the end, the bulla wasn't just a charm, it was a covenant, a whisper between generations that said, "You are precious. You are watched over, you belong." The sagas tell of a punishment so brutal it blurred the line between execution and dark artistry, the blood eagle. According to Norse lore, certain traitors or defeated kings met their end not just in agony, but transformed into grotesque living sculptures. The victim was laid prone, their back sliced open along the spine. Ribs were methodically severed from the vertebrae and splayed outward like the beams of a ship's hull. Then came the final flourish. The lungs, still heaving, were pulled through the wounds and draped over the shoulders, their rhythmic inflation mimicking the beating wings of an eagle. This wasn't mere killing, it was ritualized theater, a cosmic balancing of honor and horror. Yet for all its vividness in Viking poetry, the blood eagle's historical reality remains fiercely debated. No archaeological evidence, no mass graves with telltale rib trauma, no contemporary accounts from outsiders conclusively proves it happened. The most detailed descriptions come from Icelandic sagas written centuries after the Viking Age, like the Orkneyinga saga and Tale of Ragnar's Sons, where the act is reserved for arch-villains like King Aelle of Northumbria, who allegedly murdered the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. These texts straddle history and myth, leaving scholars divided. Was the blood eagle a real practice, a rare and sacred vengeance, or a literary device to underscore the saga's themes of betrayal and retribution? Supporters of its authenticity point to oblique clues. The 9th century Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentions captured Vikings being spread-eagled, possibly a euphemism for the ritual. Tacitus, writing about Germanic tribes centuries earlier, describes sacrificial victims having their lungs torn out, suggesting a deeper regional tradition. Even the mechanics are plausible. A skilled executioner could theoretically separate ribs without immediate death, though the victim would succumb swiftly to shock or suffocation. The symbolism, too, fits Viking cosmology. Eagles were sacred to Odin, the god of war and wisdom, and the act's theatricality mirrored Norse values. A punishment should be as memorable as the crime. Skeptics, however, counter with forensic and logistical hurdles. Human ribs are tightly connected. Prying them intact from the spine without modern tools would be monstrously difficult. No surviving Viking legal codes mention the blood eagle, odd for such a weighty penalty. Some argue the sagas misinterpreted older Kenninga poetic metaphors comparing battle wounds to eagles feasting, which later writers took literally. The blood eagle might be a misunderstanding, like mistaking raining cats and dogs for an actual weather phenomenon. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The blood eagle may have been rare, reserved for exceptional betrayals, its details exaggerated over time. Or it could have been a post-mortem display, mutilating corpses to send a message rather than prolonging suffering. Either way, its power endures. Whether fact or folklore, the blood eagle captures something essential about the Viking world. A place where justice and cruelty shared the same blade, where reputation outlived the body, and where even death could be shaped into a story too chilling to forget. For the bound-foot women of imperial China, every step was an act of endurance, but their suffering didn't end with tight bandages. To soothe their aching, deformed feet and maintain an air of effortless grace, concubines developed a ritual as delicate as it was painful. Nightly herbal foot massages using silk pouches filled with fragrant botanicals. This wasn't mere pampering, it was survival. The process began with a concoction of medicinal herbs, chrysanthemum to reduce swelling, peony root to numb pain, and cloves to mask the inevitable odor of decaying flesh. These ingredients were ground into powders, then carefully sealed inside silk sachets, their fabric fine enough not to irritate the skin but sturdy enough to hold the precious contents. Before bed, a concubine would warm the pouch over incense, letting the heat activate the herb's properties, then knead it against her broken arches in slow, circular motions. Servants often performed this task, their skilled fingers working to ease the relentless throbbing caused by years of crushed bones and constrained toes. Foot binding reshaped the entire body's alignment, so these massages weren't just about comfort, they were a corrective measure. Without them, a woman's feet might stiffen into uselessness, making her favored status precarious. The silk pouches also served a subtler purpose, to soften calluses and keep the skin supple, ensuring that lotus feet remained pleasing to the touch. Emperor Qianlong's court records describe concubines whose foot care rituals were as elaborate as their makeup routines, with different herb blends for seasons, cooling mint for summer, warming ginger for winter. The cruel irony, these massages perpetuated the very system that necessitated them. By mitigating the worst effects of foot binding, they allowed women to endure the practice longer, maintaining the illusion that such beauty came without consequence. The silk pouches became symbols of paradox, both a lifeline and a shackle, masking suffering beneath elegance. Today, a handful of museums preserve these delicate sachets, their embroidery still vibrant, their herbal scent long faded. They're relics of a time when pain wore the guise of refinement, and every soft step was bought with hours of silent agony. The concubines are gone, but their silk pouches whisper a reminder. Sometimes the most exquisite traditions hide the deepest wounds. In the heart of ancient Athens, where democracy was both a cherished ideal and a fragile experiment, citizens wielded an unusual weapon against the threat of tyranny: broken pottery. Every year, the assembly would gather to decide if an ostracism vote was needed, a process not to punish crimes but to prevent them. If the majority agreed, the city would prepare for a quiet yet decisive act of collective judgment. Each eligible voter took a shard of pottery, an ostracon, and scratched onto it the name of the person they believed posed a danger to the state. No formal charges, no lengthy trials. Just a name on a piece of broken clay, and with enough votes, that individual would be exiled for 10 years, banished from Athens with their property intact but their influence erased. This wasn't capricious persecution. Ostracism was a carefully calibrated safety valve, designed to neutralize potential tyrants before they could seize power. The law, attributed to the reformer Cleisthenes in the 5th century BC, reflected a paradox at the core of Athenian democracy: the need to protect the system from the very ambition that fueled it. The most famous casualty, the aristocrat Aristides, earned his exile not through treachery but simply because his reputation as the just had grown too formidable. Plutarch recounts how an illiterate farmer, unaware of Aristides' identity, handed him an ostracon and asked him to scratch the name Aristides onto it. When Aristides asked why, the farmer replied, "Because I'm tired of hearing him called the just." The logistics were as ingenious as they were simple. Unlike the secret ballots of modern democracies, ostracism votes were public yet anonymous names scrawled in haste, the handwriting of allies indistinguishable from foes. Archaeologists have found piles of ostraca bearing not just names but sometimes biting commentary. Themistocles, son of Neocles, this traitor, or Pericles, the onion head. Some shards were even pre-scratched, suggesting political operatives distributed them to sway the vote, but the system had its flaws. Exile didn't require a supermajority, just 6,000 votes, leaving room for factions to manipulate outcomes. When the demagogue Hyperbolus was ostracized around 400 BC, the act backfired spectacularly. His rivals, Alcibiades and Nicias, temporarily set aside their feud to orchestrate his banishment, a move so transparently self-serving that the practice fell into disrepute shortly after. The Athenians realized ostracism could be weaponized not against tyrants, but as a tool for petty score settling. Yet for nearly a century, this peculiar institution worked. It tempered rivalries, diffused tensions, and gave the demos a way to recalibrate power without violence. Unlike Roman proscriptions or medieval executions, ostracism left room for redemption. The exiled could return after a decade, their status and wealth restored. In a world where political disputes often ended in bloodshed, that was progress. The surviving ostraca now sit in museums, their once potent curses reduced to historical curiosities. But they whisper a timeless lesson that every democracy grapples with: how to balance collective security against individual ambition. The Athenians didn't perfect the solution, but they dared to invent one using nothing more sophisticated than broken pottery and the will of the people. In the end, ostracism wasn't just about expelling threats. It was about proving that even the mightiest could be held accountable, one humble shard at a time. In the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, where gold and jade glittered under the Mesoamerican sun, the most coveted currency wasn't mined from the earth, it grew on trees. For the Aztecs, cacao beans weren't just the foundation of frothy, spiced chocolate drinks reserved for nobles and warriors. They were literal money, a form of legal tender so valuable that counterfeiting could cost you your life. Picture this: a handful of these glossy, bitter beans could buy you a canoe full of fresh avocados, a sturdy cotton cloak, or even the services of a skilled porter for an entire day. But woe to anyone caught trying to pass off carved clay replicas as the real thing. The penalty wasn't just a slap on the wrist, but execution by public strangulation or being beaten to death with clubs. The system was astonishingly precise. Historians estimate that a single cacao bean held roughly the same purchasing power as a modern U.S. quarter, with standardized exchange rates woven into daily commerce. Need a turkey for dinner? That'll cost you 100 beans, a slave between 500 and 1,000, depending on their skills. Even the legendary conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo marveled at how cacao functioned as seamlessly as gold coins in European markets, noting how Aztec traders would count them out by fives and tens as carefully as a banker handles his ducats. But why cacao? Unlike perishable goods like maize or fragile quills filled with gold dust, the beans were durable, portable, and impossible to replicate without detection. Their natural bitterness made them unappealing to eat raw, ensuring they circulated as currency rather than snacks. The Aztecs also believed cacao was a divine gift. Myths told how the god Quetzalcoatl stole the sacred tree from paradise to bestow upon humanity. This spiritual weight elevated cacao beyond mere commodity. It was a tangible connection to the gods, making its misuse not just criminal but blasphemous. The elite took this reverence further. While commoners might hoard beans for practical trade, rulers stockpiled them in royal granaries as a form of state wealth. Moctezuma Roman II palace reportedly held over 900,000 pounds of cacao, a treasury literally fit for a king. Nobles consumed chocolate as a frothy, spiced beverage mixed with chili, vanilla, or honey, served in golden cups meant to be sipped slowly during diplomatic meetings or sacred rituals. To waste cacao was unthinkable. To adulterate it with counterfeit beans was a sin against both economy and cosmos. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of this system's dark underbelly. In the ruins of Tlatelolco's marketplace, they found carefully crafted clay beans, their surfaces painted to mimic the real thing, likely the doomed handiwork of counterfeiters. Other digs revealed caches of beans deliberately broken in half, a practice possibly used to make small change for transactions requiring fractions. The Aztecs even had financial inspectors who'd bite into suspect beans to test their authenticity, their trained palates detecting the telltale bitterness of true cacao versus the chalky taste of fakes. The Spanish invasion shattered this system. Initially, conquistadors dismissed cacao as Indian money, but they quickly grasped its value, adopting it to pay indigenous laborers during construction projects. Over time, European coins replaced beans, but the legacy lingered. In parts of Mexico, cacao remained a bartering tool well into the 19th century, a stubborn echo of an empire where money didn't just buy power, it grew on trees steeped in blood, spice, and divinity. Today, as we unwrap a chocolate bar without a second thought, it's worth remembering, once this humble bean was worth killing for, a currency that proved even the sweetest luxuries can have brutally sharp edges. For the Maori people of New Zealand, skin was never just skin, it was living parchment, etched with chisels and ink to tell stories no book could hold. The Moko, their intricate facial tattoos, weren't mere decoration. They were maps of identity, genealogy, and social standing carved directly into the flesh. Each curve, line, and spiral revealed a person's ancestry, achievements, and even their place in the community's spiritual hierarchy. Unlike tattoos elsewhere, which might be decorative or symbolic, Moko served as a visual language, a permanent declaration of who you were and where you belonged in the world. The process was as brutal as it was sacred. Artists called Tohunga Tamoko used chisels made from albatross bone or sharpened metal, tapping them with a mallet to drive pigment typically made from burned wood or caterpillars deep into the skin. No numbing agents eased the pain. Endurance was part of the ritual. The sound of the chisel striking flesh echoed like a woodpecker's rhythm, each tap a deliberate act of transformation. Swelling was so severe that recipients often couldn't eat solid food for weeks, sipping liquids through wooden funnels to avoid disturbing their healing wounds. Yet this suffering was embraced as necessary, a physical trial that mirrored the spiritual weight of the markings. Designs weren't chosen lightly. Men's moko koi covered the entire face in bold, symmetrical patterns, with the forehead often displaying their tribal affiliations and the cheeks signaling their rank as warriors or leaders. Women's moko focused on the lips and chin, with delicate scrolls that indicated their lineage and marital status. Even the placement of a single spiral could distinguish a chief from a commoner, or a descendant of a famous navigator from someone whose ancestors were known as healers. The British explorer Joseph Banks, witnessing moko in the 18th century, wrote that no two designs were alike. Each was as unique as a fingerprint, deliberately designed to be impossible to counterfeit or steal. But moko was more than personal branding. These tattoos were believed to carry mana, a spiritual power that connected the wearer to their ancestors. The act of receiving moko was a dialogue with the dead, as if the chisel's blows summoned the voices of those who came before. Some designs included specific elements to honor a revered forebear, creating a literal bridge between past and present. This spiritual dimension made moko taboo for outsiders. To wear one without the proper lineage or standing was considered a grave offense, an act of theft from the collective memory of a people. Colonization nearly erased the practice. Christian missionaries, repulsed by what they saw as barbarism, pressured Maori to abandon moko, and by the early 20th century, the art form teetered on extinction. But like the designs themselves, the tradition refused to fade completely. In recent decades, moko has experienced a powerful revival, with Maori reclaiming it as both a cultural emblem and a political statement. Modern recipients often blend traditional motifs with contemporary elements, using the tattoos to assert indigenous identity in a world that once tried to erase it. Today, when a Maori person chooses to wear moko, it's more than a tribute to tradition, it's a defiance of oblivion. A declaration that their stories, carved in pain and pride, will never be silenced. The chisel's echo hasn't faded, it's grown louder, a resonant reminder that some histories can't be written in ink alone. They must be felt, endured, and carried on the skin forever. From poison banquet entertainment to sky burials where vultures carry souls to the heavens, these 30 customs prove one thing: humanity's imagination for ritual knows no bounds. What unites them isn't just their shock value, but the profound role they played in shaping civilizations. The Aztec priest who offered a beating heart to the sun wasn't acting out of cruelty, but out of a desperate contract with the cosmos. The Viking widow who stepped onto a burning ship did so believing her sacrifice would echo through the ages. Even the Roman father clasping a bulla around his son's neck was weaving an invisible thread between the mortal and divine. These practices weren't just quirks of history, they were solutions to the universal human questions. How do we control the uncontrollable? How do we honor the sacred? How do we belong? Some customs, like Sparta's brutal infant inspections, reveal the lengths societies will go to curate strength. Others, like Japan's 1,000 origami cranes, show how tenderness can emerge from tragedy. What fascinates isn't just the diversity of answers, but how fiercely our ancestors clung to them, turning fear, love, and power into rituals that still haunt or inspire us today. Now we're turning the conversation over to you. Which of these customs left you stunned? Was it the Mayan nobles drawing thorns through their tongues, or the Babylonian brides auctioned like treasures? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing which slices of history spark your curiosity. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the strange, the beautiful, and the downright baffling corners of the past, don't forget to subscribe. After all, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the wild, messy, and extraordinary ways humans have tried to make sense of this world. Who knows what unbelievable tradition we'll uncover next?